Message from Amana IFS. Riba is a terrible sin. Easily move your business or personal insurance to Amana IFS. Call 0861 786 and leave riba for good. So there's an instruction or a message that you can reflect on. Now, interesting enough, I've got 2 days to go for the show, and that's it. Unless we do not sight the moon on Sunday night, and then we'll have an extra show on Monday. But with that in mind, I'm very glad as we look at the history of South African mosques, some historically or significant mosques in our country, that before we wrap up this Ramadan, I get a chance to speak to Yunus Chamda. We talk about many other things every other day of the week, but we talk about the Vereeniging Mosque, the town mosque, that is. Yunus, appreciate your time. Salaam alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thanks for having me, Ashraf, and greetings
to you. Well, it's a good thing we're talking, because I certainly know about this fabulous pictorial history of Roshni that you're putting together, and it will be launched soon. But it's a necessary segue then in looking at some of the fundamentals of that community of Vereeniging, and therefore the Vereeniging Mosque, right? So we've been looking at historical mosques. So maybe take me back to when that mosque was started, the who, what, when, where, why of it.
Right, Ashraf. I think that a good starting point is that you've couched your program on the significance of mosques, and the Vereeniging Mosque is by no means one of the oldest. It doesn't have that history of age. We know some of the early mosques were in the 1700s in the Cape, nor is it the largest. But as we discuss this mosque, I think there's a great significance in terms of how this mosque has survived. Despite the attempts to wipe it out from the center of Vereeniging, and that I think is great significance in that it still stands there today. But if we were to
tell us what happened there. I mean, maybe just pick up on that in terms of what was the attempts to wipe it out.
Yes, I'm going to. It was part of the Group Areas Act. But let me go back to where the mosque was, the first established, which was the first question you raised. Now, the Muslim community in Vereeniging people started moving into Vereeniging in the early 1900s. And, this was a great boom period for Vereeniging because gold was discovered, in the 1860s, and then, diamonds and gold, and then they needed fuel for the industry. And so what happened was that coal was discovered on the banks of the Vaal River, and Vereeniging as a town began to flourish. So once the early pioneer families moved into Vereeniging in the early 1900s, we find that some of these pioneer families, they immediately started to establish the masjid. And we know from historical records that by 1912, an organization was established called the Vereeniging Mohammedan Mosque. So this was in 1912. What we also then know is that by 1917, they started building this masjid. And, a real tribute to the early trustees of that mosque. And if I just mention some of the early pioneer families, there was, the Isuk Gattu. Muhammad Isuk Gattu was one of the first Muslim families to move into Vereeniging as early as 1903. Yeah. And then we had Muhammad Ismail Dasu, and then we had the Aswad family. And, we're going to talk a little bit about the Aswad family because they played a very, very significant role in the establishment of the Vereeniging Masjid. Now, what we also know is that the legal transfer of this property happened on the 29th of August 1917. This title deed was transferred into the name of the Vereeniging Mohammedan Mosque. Now, what happened was that even though the administrative matters were being sorted out, the community obviously were very anxious to build the masjid. And what they then did is that they laid the foundation stone of this masjid, right? Earlier that year in 1917. And we find that this foundation stone is still there. And, it was laid by Maulvi Ahmad Hassan Bam from Simlek. And, your listeners will know that, his grandson was the late Maulana Yahya Bam, who passed away, earlier this year. So that was
recently, yes, right. I remember that.
Was his maternal grandfather, and he came to lay the stone. Well, he came via Maputo, Lorenzo Marx in those days and opened a madrasa, and then he came to Vereeniging and he laid this foundation stone, then went on to Johannesburg. And, sadly, we are now in a pandemic era. The Spanish flu was about in 1918 in Johannesburg, and then he fell ill and he passed away and never returned to India, to complete his mission of raising funds. But in any event, the mosque was then, clearly established. What we then see is very early photographs of this mosque. And from the early photographs that we have, well, one of the earliest photographs we have is around 1920, 1930. And we see this mosque along, and you'd have it now on screen. If you look on the right-hand side, is a building, but on the left, you see the minaret of the masjid.
I do, yeah.
And what is very important is that what we learn out of this photograph is that those founding trustees had made some very important decisions. Once they acquired the property, they didn't just establish the masjid and surround it with gardens and parking, etc. But what they did was they developed the masjid on the inner precinct and on the outer precinct facing main road, which is now Voortrekker Road. They put businesses which then generated income for the masjid, and they also put up this beautiful minaret. So
the sustainability was important, yeah.
In fact, that sustainability is still benefiting the Vereeniging and Roshni community till this day. Because if we look at in the 60s, and we look at the mosque in the 60s, we have beautiful photographs of the mosque, and there you see it. It was really an imposing landmark in Vereeniging. And you will know if you look lower down the businesses below, Tower Fruit is very correctly named, belonged to the Abdullah family. And then the Saleh family had a business directly under that minaret. And if you look at in the bottom right hand, you see, there's advertising board where the ABC stores and the Gama family business was.
And of course, we both have a connection to them. Yeah, absolutely.
Correct.
Fascinating. Yeah.
What they also did was, the community didn't have a school. So an upper level was built, which housed the Vereeniging Indian School back in those days.
Wow.
But to come to that really significant issue, we all know that, the Group Areas Act was passed in 1950, and then by the late 70s and early 80s, there was real pressure on the Indian community to move out of the center of town and to move to an Indian plaza. And, our worst fears were realized when on the 18th of November, 1983, an expropriation notice was served on the mosque.
Okay.
Well, saying that, the property is going to be expropriated and, the mosque will disappear. So, there were real efforts to get rid of the mosque. I mean, there was a lot of competing commercial interests from the white community, and they really wanted to get hold of this mosque and of this property, rather. So, I mean, our chaps were quite besides themselves. If you talk to the family members of the trustees, I mean, they were completely besides themselves. The thought of losing the mosque was just unthinkable. But what they then did is they approached a very young Rafiq Baba who just started practicing law in Vereeniging. And he said to them that, we must seek advice from the most senior Muslim lawyers that we can. And they set up a delegation and they drove down to Durban to meet with Hafez advocate A.B. Mohammed.
Okay, very well known too. Yeah, absolutely.
Right, exactly. And he did a tremendous job, because what he did is that he made an appeal to the Minister of Community Development. And he made this argument that we can't negotiate, a value, because this is a waqf, and a waqf can never be negotiated. And with Allah's mercy, the expropriation was rescinded. And
on that basis, that the waqf can't be sold, so there's a value. Yeah.
Exactly.
Fascinating. Yeah. So then to fast forward to now, I mean, obviously demographics have changed. The community lives in Roshni. There are still businesses, I gather, in town. What's the position of the mosque now in terms of its function?
Well, it continues to be a fully functional masjid. It's well attended, and it has a dawah center as well. but the commercial part of the property still continues to generate tremendous amount of income. But just two quick points, Ashraf, that will be interesting. I mean, obviously, there's all of the very memorable imams that served in the masjid, and Maulana Jibai, Maulana Rahmani, Sheikh Sardar, Maulvi Bula, Maulvi Qasim Ali, Hafsa Balisha, Yusuf Gorachini. I mean, these are all the names that come to mind. But just a note about Maulana Qasim Ali, the community will never forget this. In February 1975, he was leading the Asr Salah. Right?
Okay.
And in the second rakat, he was in sujood. The entire congregation was in sujood, and he didn't get up for a while. And Hafizab Dastu, who was in the Jamaat as well, he saw, he realized that something is amiss, and he tried to intervene, and found that Maulvi Qasim Ali had in fact passed away, in his salah. And the community will never sort of forget that.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's all the trustees down the years. There's almost 3 generations of trustees who've really done a tremendous job to keep this masjid going.
Well, I tell you, it's a fabulous and fascinating history, from your community, right? How, in terms of its broader impact to the Vereeniging community, not so much amongst Muslims. You mentioned dawah work. How has that impact been realized now?
Well, I mean, if you go to the masjid, yes, times have changed, and the congregation in terms of the racial composition has changed, but that is as it should be, because the masjid must serve the Muslims of the area, irrespective of race or color, and that continues till today. I mean, there are many foreigners in the city, and they all use the masjid, as do our businessmen who still continues to trade in the
Now you said, I mean, you gave that the story about from the initial period to now, and I take it that it was a functioning masjid then. In that period, as you said, from 1820 to 1830, what I'm getting at is there a date that you can put down to say this was the date it became a functioning masjid? And why I'm saying that is not just because of your book, but there's obviously there's a centenary that can be celebrated, isn't it?
Yes, I think we've passed that, because 1917 is really the, if you talk about when was this masjid established, 1917 is the year that we use as a significant.
Okay, so as even though they were still building as a functioning mosque, right? Okay. Yeah. Anything else you'd like to share with us about the mosque before I let you go that you think that the audience would need to know?
Well, I mean, the mosque has also had many esteemed guests over the years, which the community was always excited about. And the one that pops to mind is in 1963, Qari Tayyib Sahib, who was then the principal of the Darul Ulum in Deoband, was touring South Africa. It was quite an occasion when he came to the Vereeniging Mosque, and in my book I have several photographs of that visit, and there was quite a bit of excitement around that.
Well, I tell you what, I'm going to let you go, but I'm not going to let you go without you mentioning one thing, and I'm going to indulge you because I know you can talk about it, of your own history in terms of the adoption of the Constitution in our country, because we had Freedom Day yesterday, right? So I want you to include yourself in this history. We voted in 1994, but the Constitution was adopted a few years later. So when did that happen? And somehow or the other, you were involved in that, and you better tell us why.
Yes, I was hoping you don't bring that up. But in 1996, the Constitution was signed into law in Sharpeville, and by President Mandela. And I happened to just be the mayor of the Vaal at the time, so I was the hosting mayor at that very auspicious event. And yes, I do have some very fond memories of that day.
I'm sure. Well, I mean, I've got the book of the Constitution, of course. You front cover, because I mean, you were the mayor, and you had Mandela, and you had do you have the incumbent president as well in those pictures, right?
Correct. Cyril Ramaphosa was then the chair of the Constitutional Assembly. So he was responsible for the draft.
So when we talk about the history of Vereeniging or Roshni, we can't exclude the Vereeniging Town Mosque. When we talk about the history of Roshni, we also, or Vereeniging, we can't exclude Yunus Chamda and your role in that history as well. Shukran, thanks for talking to us. Really enlightening, and hopefully we'll connect again soon, inshallah.
Jazakallah. Assalamu alaikum.
There we are. How fascinating is that? Both just from the Vereeniging Mosque and in terms of the narrator here, in terms of the story. But Yunus has put together a book which I think will be launched pretty soon. The 55-year pictorial history of Roshni, 1967 to 2020. Tells you once again the absolute importance of knowing your history. And if you think that's not important, just think about this one year, right? When it comes to, from a pure Islamic point of view, when it comes to understanding the mannerisms and the actions of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which we know now as the Sunnah, right? And you know, it always is. He did this as narrated by person so and so. I mean, that is an active example of understanding history. The need to preserve what people said, what people did, and how they do so. That is why we have this canon of the Sunnah. And in the same way, therefore, when you look back at your own communities or your own families, the need, therefore, to document your history and to relate it both in text form, but also just in good conversation, fireside conversations, I think are particularly important, as you just heard. Maybe more of that needs to happen, right? Let's wrap up by just reminding you, as always, that that Santio is an ethically based asset manager that is focused on delivering superior risk-adjusted returns for their clients, regardless of market conditions. Now, for more info on their Sharia investment products, visit their website, santiocapital.com, and start saving towards your investment goals today. Santio Capital Management, invest for good. Santio Capital Management is an authorized financial services provider. So tomorrow, we're going to talk about this. Don't miss this one. Which should well be the last show, but maybe another one on Monday. We don't know, right? But whatever. Importantly, as part of the big picture, we will focus on the impact of Muslim organizations and welfare and relief organizations in Ramadan, and the impact that they have in Ramadan on the broader South African society. So we'll chat to Dr. Quresh Suleiman, in fact, about that. Looking forward to that conversation, and you should too as well. Assalamu alaikum.